Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Tonight, we analyse the latest developments in US foreign and economic policy following Donald Trump's recent remarks on Vladimir Putin and global trade. Trump had hinted at imposing secondary sanctions on Russia and suggested a new wave of tariffs that could impact key allies and trading partners. What does this mean for global diplomacy and the economy? Well, joining us to discuss this is Vladislav Davidzon, European correspondent for Tablet magazine. Vladimir, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Sorry, Vladislav, I beg your pardon. It's a pleasure. So let's start with tariffs, President Trump's weapon of choice. Tomorrow's Liberation Day, that's what he's named it, where he's going to start announcing his tariffs. What do you think he's going to say?
First of all, liberation, because he considers any systems or any restraints, any international systems that were built by the Americans and the Europeans after World War II as constraining America's freedom to move. He considers the entire gamut of international institutions which the Americans built, from the IMF to the World Bank, to the United Nations, to NATO, to any number of trade agreements, to basically anything with American treaty obligations to it, as a form of constraint that keeps America from being a colossus in the world and keeps Americans from getting rich and Americans from doing the kinds of deals that they'd like to be doing. So when he says Liberation Day, he actually means it because he believes that America is being repressed, even though these are, these are institutions that were built by Americans to make the world better for everybody, but ultimately they did favor American business and American diplomacy and American needs and American requirements and American goals and values.
Yes, but the point is that was a different context when these international bodies were set up.
Right.
His attitude is clearly very different today. Now, what's he trying to achieve with these tariffs? Let's start with Russia. Because he's threatening to impose secondary tariffs on oil, on goods made from oil. What's the aim of this?
The tariffs which are aimed at the Russians are aimed entirely at the Russian war machine and at Russian capacity to fight in Ukraine and at Russian capacity to export their energy reserves all across the world. Russia, since this war began, not since 2014, since the full-scale invasion began in February 22, has become fully an oil an energy exporting state. Right? The old jokes about Russia being a gas station with nuclear weapons are even more true when 85% of the receipts of the Russian state come from gas and oil exports, right?
Yes, but the sanctions have been in place, to stop Russia from exporting oil and gas, well, since their full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Why do we need secondary sanctions on oil derivative products?
Because the Russians figured out very creative and very flexible ways to get around those sanctions. They found ways to not do business in US dollars. So the way that America does its sanctions is that you have a certificate from US Treasury that sanctions your bank, your structure, your government agency, whatever, if it deals in any way in a sale or transaction using US dollars, right? So just about, you can't really do business in the world without using US dollars and or euros, right? Most every transaction in the world at some point requires going through the dollar-denominated system. So in order to be able to bypass that kind of thing, the Russians built up a system of relationships and a system of export and logistics that was gray and black. And it dealt with export banks in places like India, which would not go fully in on the sanction regime, and were happy to sell Russia to buy Russian energy using rupees. The Chinese, obviously, they were using Chinese currency. So in order to actually get those derivative systems, which are held by companies which are offshore, maybe in Jersey or Switzerland or any number of offshore spaces, you have to go around to a specific company and actually get them, right? As opposed to just getting everyone who works in dollars.
Yes, but Russia has very adequately shown that it can sidestep the sanctions that have been imposed on it. Surely the problem is one of enforcement,
right,
rather than, laying on even more sanctions, which then in the end don't get enforced.
Well, it is a question of whack-a-mole. Let's say you're a Swiss businessman, or let's say you're a Russian origin businessman with a Moldovan passport and British residency who has a company in Luxembourg and Switzerland, and you figure out a way to get a, let's say, Indian flagged vessel on an old Iranian shipping container, and you route it through, let's say, Germany. It takes European, American, and British enforcement mechanisms and enforcers a while to unwind all that stuff. It's very complicated. You have shell companies, you have companies within companies. So, it's like playing whack-a-mole. You have to figure out who's doing what,
right,
where they're hiding,
right,
where they're hiding stuff.
Now I want to talk about why President Trump is threatening Putin with these secondary sanctions. It's basically, he said that if he feels that Putin is dragging his feet when it comes to agreeing to some kind of ceasefire, then Trump will impose those. Is Putin dragging his feet?
Absolutely, 100%.
Why do you say that?
1,000%. Putin does not actually want an armistice, and he does not even really, it turns out, want a ceasefire. The negotiations went from very big goals to very small goals. I mean, you couldn't even get a 30-day ceasefire out of Russia and Ukraine. They're at the point where they're just trying to get a Black Sea deal or a deal for the Russians and Ukrainians to stop hitting each other's energy capacity, energy exporting structures, and in the case of Ukraine, domestic civilian infrastructure, right? So the Ukrainians want to be in a situation where they are not maligned and they're not left holding the bag security-wise, where the Russians can rearm and rebuild and regenerate their forces and come back and destroy them. Whereas the Russians just want to get as many concessions as they can from the... Yeah.
We have a short soundbite that I'd like to share with you, and I'd like to get your view on it.
Sir.
I think we will. No, I want to make sure that he follows through, and I think he will. I don't want to go secondary tariffs on his oil, but I think, it's something I would do if I thought he wasn't doing the job.
Sounds he's a bit more optimistic than you are, Vladislav, that, Putin is actually going to follow through.
Yeah, he's ever optimistic. It's one of his more endearing traits, actually. He's an optimist. And Americans are optimistic people, and this is not an easy deal to do, because the Ukrainians, both the regimes, both the Russian regime and the Ukrainian democratic system, the political system, are facing, as they see, existential annihilation if they lose this war.
Right.
But in fact, both Vladimir and Vladimir quite conceivably imagine being killed with their families if they lose this war, right?
Right.
Both of them see their entire country, their own family and their wealth and everything riding on the outcome of this war. So when a leader of your country is that deep, has that much skin in the game, it's very difficult to make both of them take a difficult deal.
Indeed.
So I didn't actually think that Trump would be able to get a end of conflict, end of claims deal. And when I was writing about this in November and December, it was exactly what I predicted would happen. He would force the arm of the Ukrainians, and then when having a lot of leverage on the Ukrainians as opposed to Russia, he got them to make concessions and promised to make a deal. He would be hard pressed to get Putin to make one because Putin just doesn't want to.
Doesn't want a deal.
Just doesn't want a deal.
I'd like to move on now to Trump threatening to impose tariffs on, well, he's already imposed some tariffs on Europe, on cars, on steel and other metals. What should Europe's response be to this?
Well, luckily I don't work in Brussels, luckily for everybody, and what they're going to wind up doing is declare trade war. They're going to be very, very, very efficient and kind of nasty. I'm going to use the N-word, nasty. It's a very interesting thing about the Europeans. On some things, they're quite loosey-goosey, inefficient. There's too much corroboration, too many cooks in the kitchen. On anything having to do with money, the European Union always seems to run a very tight ship. The Europeans are very much aligned on counter tariffs. There's going to be a trade war depending on what Trump actually proposes tomorrow. I have no doubt that he's actually very serious about this. He's a true believer in tariffs, and he is a isolationist in terms of protecting American businesses as he sees it. And
but he's also said on a number of occasions, hasn't he, Vladislav, that he is prepared to do a tit for tat. So if a country plays ball, then he may negotiate a lower tariff or maybe remove them altogether. Now, take Poland for example. I mean, he's very happy with Poland because it's spending almost 5% on defence, and President Trump likes that.
Loves it.
So is there an opportunity where his tariff regime is going to be divided between countries that play ball and those that don't?
Well, he's absolutely very transactional, and he's absolutely very flexible. Well, there are good things about that, and there are really terrible things about that. It's actually easy in some ways to do a deal with someone who's not particularly wedded to any emotional outcome, right? In some ways, it's easier for a guy like Trump to make a deal between the Russians and the Ukrainians because he couldn't care less, unlike the Polish politicians who I spoke to today, what the actual deal looks like, right? He just wants a deal, and whatever that deal looks like, that's between the Russians and the Ukrainians. You guys figure that out. Just give me something to sign. Let me stand in front of a camera and make a deal and be a deal maker.
Right.
So his flexibility is in some ways a very pragmatic, practical thing, which makes it easy for him to negotiate. And other ways, it's terrible because he says one thing on Monday, and on Wednesday the wind blows another way, and he backtracks on his comments.
Yeah, well, some say that that's actually part of his negotiating style. Throw 100%. Throw everything up in the air.
Madman theory works, and he's I mean, look, I often had to explain this to.
Unfortunately, we've only got a few seconds left. If I can ask you to quickly.
I've had to explain to lots of people that Madman theory works, and that he is a real estate man in his head, and everything is a real estate deal.
Right. Thank you very much indeed for your analysis.
Thank you, sir.
Pleasure talking to you. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Good night.